When is the Israeli government going to produce compelling evidence that the Al-Shifa hospital has been a centre of Hamas activity?
First of all, Israel has already revealed evidence of Hamas operations inside the Al-Shifa hospital on the first day, showing all those RPGs and Kalashnikov rifles. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen as many RPGs as that in the Royal Free Hospital, but you don't normally find them in a hospital. Yesterday, we revealed a tunnel shaft opening under the hospital, and we're continuing our search. Now, I know that many people would like, in the very first news cycle, the IDF to pull a Wizard of Oz, pull the curtain open and say ta-da, but this is a complex that Hamas has spent the last 16 years building, and a month to cover its tracks because they knew that we were coming.
Well,
we have reporters on the ground.
Of course, before the capture of the hospital, Ms. Levy, you will know that the IDF had said several times and had gone to great lengths to depict that particular medical complex as a headquarters from Hamas. Has the evidence been produced so far to vindicate that in any way?
And we are continuing to reveal that evidence, even if it takes slightly more than 24 hours.
So it will come. It will come.
Of course it's coming. Of course it's coming. And I'll show you, for example, what the IDF has been finding elsewhere in Gaza City. We've found tunnel shafts poking out underneath children's beds. We've found rockets being stored under a girl's mattress. We found bombs being stored in a kindergarten, rockets being stored inside science classrooms. We found rocket launchers with cables that lead into clinics and mosques. You know, just like British troops in 1945 marched through Nazi Germany and uncovered the evidence of Germany's war crimes, we are doing the same and showing the cynical way in which Hamas has spent 16 years embedding itself in civilian infrastructure because its whole strategy is based on human shields.
Surely you wouldn't compare what the Allies found in the 1940s by what you found so far in that hospital.
We are absolutely comparing the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated on October 7th.
Of course, but that's a slightly different point to what's involved in the hospital.
Well, Lewis, when we're talking about tunnel shafts underneath children's beds and rockets being stored underneath children's bedrooms, we are talking about atrocious war crimes, military using their own civilians as human shields. We are finding evidence of a vast terror state, a vast underground city that has been deliberately embedded under civilian areas because Hamas knows that makes it difficult for the IDF to target them. Look, let me give you one example, because I think there's some confusion. Some people, perhaps in the West, seem to think that Israel wants to target civilians, and I'll tell you who knows that Israel does not want to do that. Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Just yesterday, we declassified evidence, a telephone conversation between two Islamic Jihad operatives, talking about moving around anti-tank missiles in a baby pram. A baby pram, because they know that when they disguise it that way.
You will also know that the director of the Gaza Strip main hospital, which has been raided, the Al-Shifa hospital, has said that the facility has now run out of oxygen and water, and patients are screaming from thirst. That sounds like a pretty horrendous act. You don't agree? You don't accept that that's the case?
No, because when Israeli soldiers went into the hospital together with medical teams and Arabic speakers, we delivered a very large consignment of humanitarian aid. We delivered incubators, we delivered baby food, we delivered medicine, and we delivered a lot of water as well.
But you know,
we take that responsibility very seriously.
But you wouldn't pretend for a moment, of course, that the situation in those hospitals is anything less than extremely, extremely perilous.
Lewis, the whole situation is extremely perilous. Unfortunately, Hamas decided to declare war on us on October 7th with that horrific massacre of 1,200 people, and to wage it from inside a densely populated civilian area. We're doing everything we can to counteract that.
And Hamas is a terrorist state, of course, and is a terrorist organisation, and Israel is not. And so obviously the standards by which we would judge Israel would be higher. You would accept that?
Absolutely, we want to be held to the highest standards. We think that we're more than exceeding those standards.
With two fuel trucks going into the Gaza Strip so far, that's the highest standards.
Let me absolutely, because we have an obligation to ensure
for the hospitals.
May I explain?
Please.
We have an obligation to ensure that food, medicines, water reach the civilians, but not anything that is going to be used by Hamas in order to rearm.
Water isn't getting through, though, is it? They haven't got enough water.
Israel has two water pipes. Israel has two water pipes open to the Gaza Strip, including one that we had to fix under fire because it was hit by a Hamas mortar. But I want to explain this point about fuel because I understand that it's a matter of preoccupation. At the beginning of this war, Hamas sat on a vast stockpile of 500,000 liters of fuel. That's enough to circumnavigate the globe in a Boeing 747. Not only did they have their own vast stockpiles, they also stole fuel from the United Nations, 24,000 liters, UNRWA admitted this in a tweet on the 16th of October that they then hastily deleted under pressure. Not only that, but when Israel hand-delivered 300 liters of fuel to the Al-Shifa hospital last week, Hamas prevented the doctors from obtaining it and acquiring it because it might make Israel look good. So we have an obligation to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches the people, but we also have an obligation and a duty under international law to ensure that that international goodwill not be abused so that the terror organization that perpetrated the October 7th massacre can fuel its own war machine by getting more fuel. You know, many things seem to be running out in the Gaza Strip, but not rockets, which they continue firing at us.
Is there an upper limit? Is there any limit to the number of civilians who might die? And I understand the genesis of what happened on October the 7th, and I understand where this began. But is there any limit where the Israeli government will say that this is a cost which is too high, this is collateral damage which is simply too high?
Look, let me explain what the objectives of our operation are now.
I understand what the I would just appreciate if you could answer that particular question.
I want to spread out. I want to explain the thinking. We are going to destroy Hamas's terrorist infrastructure so it can never again perpetrate a massacre like it did on October 7th. We will not go back to 6 a.m. on October 7th, and Hamas can invade us at will and butcher, burn, behead, torture, and rape Israelis at will. Now, in order to do that, we're going above and beyond, trying to minimize civilian casualties as much as possible, while we are fighting an enemy that is doing everything possible to maximize casualties on its own side. It's why for a month Israel has been urging people to evacuate. I think it's fair to say we've surrendered the element of surprise by giving so much time for them to evacuate, despite Hamas telling people to stay and telling them to martyr themselves. We've been operating humanitarian corridors so that people can leave, and those corridors, our soldiers have been attacked by Hamas as we provided safe passage. Now, when the world ganged up on ISIS a decade ago, and Britain was one of the countries, one of the 86 nations that decided that ISIS can no longer be allowed to control territory, I don't recall British boots being on the ground in Raqqa and in Mosul as Britain laid waste to those cities in order to secure safe passage for Syrians and Iraqis while ISIS was firing RPGs at them.
I understand.
That is what we are doing. We are putting our own soldiers in harm's way.
I understand. But is there, again, to go to that point, you will understand, and I'm sure will be sympathetic to the fact that there are so many people across the West and elsewhere who are horrified at the sight, as they were horrified by what happened in Israel on October the 7th, are horrified by the number of civilian deaths. I know you're saying that you are doing everything you can to minimize the deaths. Fine, I accept that. Let's accept that. But they're still happening. And so I'm just asking you whether there is a limit to that, or is it all, frankly, on the table until such time as you have achieved your military objective, which we don't know when that will be, and we don't know, frankly, if it will come anytime soon.
Lewis, war is awful. We hate the situation. I hate the fact that all my friends are in reserves at the moment. This isn't a war that we started. It's not a war we wanted. It's not a war we expected. And it's a war that we're trying to end, and we're trying to end it in a way that ensures that Hamas cannot drag us back into a conflict again.
But is there a military solution to this over the long term?
Yes,
you know
the
the argument.
Complete destruction of Hamas.
But is that possible? And B, what happens if it comes at a cost of basically radicalizing much of the young people of the Gaza Strip against you, and you just violence begats violence begats violence, and it's endless?
Well, first of all, there was an enlightening poll that came out this morning of Palestinian society across the West Bank and Gaza Strip, showing that 75% supported Hamas's campaign of mass murder on October 7th. So we don't think there's much more radicalization to go. But I'll say again, if we're bringing in historical...
Well, does that not tell you something? Does that not tell you something about the political instability of the situation? And it says something about how unsustainable it is, and the fact that this is a whole group of people who are raged against the state of Israel?
Of course. It tells us that we are dealing with a society that is clinging to an ideology that says that there is no space for the state of Israel in any borders whatsoever. That is the meaning of the from the river to the sea ideology that is being amplified in the West. But if I can address your earlier question, I don't recall in 1939, 40, 41, all the way through to 45, anyone saying that if Britain continues to bomb Germany, it's only going to radicalize more Germans. And I don't remember anyone saying during the campaign against
ISIS. But it is a different situation.
That it's only going
to... They are not perfect parallels, as you know they're not. They
Nothing is a perfect parallel.
Yes, but you're the one who's brought it up, and it is a comparison which isn't especially helpful. This is a long-standing internal problem within Israel that goes back to the foundation of the State of Israel. And ultimately, isn't it the case that until such time as Israel finds a way to achieve a permanent political settlement with the Palestinians, that this is always going to be, Israel is always going to be in danger. And by bombing Gaza to bits, all it is going to do is prolong the agony for Israel and for Palestine.
Hamas doesn't want a two-state solution. Hamas wants a final solution. Hamas is a terror organization that openly says its goal is a genocide of the Jews and to murder every man, woman, child in this country. I very much hope that one day we will be able to reach a political settlement with the Palestinians and put this conflict behind us. But that will not happen as long as Hamas still roams this earth. Hamas has a long track record, its strategy for decades. Whenever there seems to be a peace process, it blows it up. It happened in the 1990s in the heydays of the Oslo Accords, when they launched their suicide bombings inside Tel Aviv. And it happens now as Israel appears to be on the brink of normalization with Saudi Arabia, that it's trying to destabilize the region. People who want peace, people who want to see coexistence, need Hamas to vacate the stage of history. Because a terror organization that perpetrates such atrocities with such horrific brutality is not a partner with which anyone can talk. This is a genocidal organization motivated by a violent and twisted religious ideology. And it is that terror organization we are going to destroy, just as 86 nations banded together to fight ISIS. And I don't recall anyone saying that if the UK continues to bomb ISIS, it's only going to radicalize another generation of Syrians and Iraqis. At some point a decade ago, the whole world realized that a violent Islamist extremist terror group cannot be allowed to control territory from which to direct attacks. And we're doing the same thing. The only difference is, Lewis, Gaza isn't halfway around the world. It's literally our backyard. If a soldier in the Gaza Strip does not attack a Hamas terrorist who's about to fire a rocket, that rocket is going to be fired and hit that soldier's house.
So to come back to the original question, at any cost, at any civilian cost, if that's what it takes, because that's what's more important.
We are going to destroy Hamas, and we are going to continue going above and beyond. No, because the way that you're phrasing the question seems to downplay our efforts to minimize civilian casualties.
I'm not downplaying it. I said in the introduction to the question, I said, let's accept what you're saying, that you are trying to downplay them, fine. But that the cost's still happening. You will accept that civilians are dying in these attacks. You will accept that. Okay, you're not intending it to happen, and that can be separated with what Hamas did, of course. But it is happening.
Hamas declared on us, and we want to end this war. And we want to end this war in a way that means that we're not going to wake up the following morning with Hamas invading Israel and abducting more of our children into the Gaza Strip. Lewis, I wish we weren't in this situation. I really wish I could wave a magic wand and make Hamas go away. But it's not going to go away if we ask it nicely, and it's not going to go away if we ask it forcefully. Hamas has forced us into a fight. It's forced us into a fight to bring back our 240 hostages, including our stolen children. And it's forced us into a fight to destroy the terror organization
Hamas isn't in the West Bank, and you still have violence and problems in the West Bank.
Of course Hamas is in the West Bank.
Well, it doesn't
Hamas
control
has a
the
presence
West
across
Bank.
Palestinian society.
But it doesn't control the West Bank. And
no, it doesn't.
And you have problems there as well.
Correct.
So it's not just about Hamas, is it? It's also about the political situation between Israel and the Palestinians. And,
as I said,
eliminating
the root cause. We can have a broader discussion, but absolutely the root cause of this conflict has been the Palestinians' insistence that there is no room for a Jewish state in any borders whatsoever. That is the meaning of from the river to the sea.
And is it also
Palestine will be free, so there should be no state of Israel.
And also, you would perhaps accept as well that there have been actions from the Israeli government over the years that have also made that potential solution less likely. For example, illegal settlement.
What I can say is that throughout history, there have been numerous junctures at which, when the question of partition came on the table and there was a prospect of peace, Israel embraced it, and the Palestinians rejected partition. This is a question that goes all the way back to 1948, when the Palestinians rejected the partition plan that the UN proposed and decided instead to wage war on Israel. But I think we're getting a little bit sidetracked at the moment because we're focusing at the moment on defeating Hamas.
One final question, because I appreciate your time. You've been generous with it, Mr. Levy.
You've been generous.
Well, indeed. Well, there we go. There has been... I was at the protests, the marches in London last Saturday, reporting on it. I noted at the time you tweeted something to say that these people were rape apologists, or that this was the biggest march for rape apologists that London had seen. That was a pretty outrageous tweet, wasn't it? There were lots of people there, plenty of people who would have no truck whatsoever with the idea of rape apology.
Well, no, because Hamas on October 7th perpetrated brutal acts of rape.
But they weren't. But you will appreciate it is a little bit more complicated than that. That it would be perfect. You would accept that it would be perfectly possible to go on a march like that, to call for a ceasefire. Okay, you don't agree with it, that's fine, but not endorse the idea of rape and not be an apologist for rape. And tweets like that, what do they achieve?
You know what, Lewis? If some people think I went too far, then I will offer this. For every person who goes on the next march and takes a selfie of themselves holding a sign saying, "I condemn Hamas for raping Israeli women and girls," I will personally donate £10 to UNRWA or any charity of their choice. They should tag me on Twitter, at Eylon Levy. £10 to the charity of their choice.
But you would accept that it would be possible to go on a march like that and not be a rape apologist, and therefore your tweet was off colour, to say the least.
I think anyone who is telling Israel that we should abandon our 30 child hostages in the hands of the paedophile rapists of Hamas, because yes, there were acts of paedophilic rape. This is the problem with this. It's the problem with this debate. Yes, okay, but they're not saying that. What I'm saying is it's possible to go on a march like that and not endorse those things. They just want a ceasefire. No, but that's the problem, because anyone who is demanding a ceasefire that leaves our hostages in Gaza and Hamas in power is saying that the rapists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre should get away with it, should not be brought to justice, and should be left free to reoffend, while Hamas leaders are telling us that they will perpetrate another October 7th and another and a million October 7th as much as it takes. That is the consequence of calling for a ceasefire. I understand people don't want more suffering. They want this war to go away. But when you are calling Israel to defend itself, you are saying that the people who burned whole families alive, who tortured children in front of their parents, mutilated parents in front of their children, who committed barbaric acts of rape, should be able to get away with it, and Israel should not be allowed to defend itself. That is the meaning of calling for a ceasefire, and that's why I repeat my challenge. Anyone going on the next protest in London, who takes a selfie of themselves with a sign saying, "I condemn Hamas for raping Israeli women and girls," I will personally donate £10 to UNRWA or any charity of their choice. They should tag me on Twitter, at Eylon Levy. I will gladly part with that money and be wrong and apologize to them for calling them rape apologists.
In terms of what the lawyer to the court for South Africa said yesterday, Adila Hassim, one of the lawyers there, when he said that quote, as I just said, "Every day there is mounting irreparable loss of life, property, dignity and humanity for the Palestinian people." There can be no arguing with that, can there?
I think the South African case is very sad because they've basically decided to become Hamas's lawyer. And I paid very close attention to what they said yesterday. And it's as if they mentioned Hamas just to tick the box, so to speak. They mentioned Hamas and they acknowledged that maybe Hamas did some bad things on October 7th. But the fact that there's a war going on between Israel and Hamas is totally forgotten. It's as if Israel is acting in a vacuum in Gaza, that Israel is not acting within the right of every country to self-defense.
Well, but Mr. Regev, as you know, yes, of course Israel has a right to self-defense, but as you know, as a state, and particularly as a signatory to the convention, Israel does not have an unqualified right of self-defense. And what the South Africans are saying, and as you know, they are supported by other states around the world, what they're saying is the
Iran and Syria,
and other countries in the global south, and even your allies, including the United States and the United Kingdom, who have stood four square behind you in many ways, have expressed concerns about Israel's behaviour. We saw Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, the other day, saying that he is worried that there may have been a contravention of international humanitarian law by your state in Israel. So this is the point. Of course you have a right to self-defense. The question is how you're prosecuting and using that right. And the accusation from South Africa and others to you is that you are abusing that right.
So, Lewis, let's be clear. I'm willing to have a serious conversation with the Brits, with the Americans about Israel's tactics. We're always willing to hear the thoughts of our friends and to engage. And can we do a better job? That's a good conversation to have. But that's not what the South Africans are doing. The South Africans have adopted full, life. How do you say it? In total, the Hamas narrative, and they're accusing Israel of genocide. And there, the British government, the American government, other Western governments have stood up and said, this is just simply not true. This is a baseless claim. I think the Americans said this is without any merit. And you have to distinguish between what is a valid argument, a valid discussion about our tactics. And we're always, as I said, willing to hear and learn from our friends and allies. But this charge of genocide is totally preposterous. It's outrageous.
But Mr. Regev, I mean, isn't it the point that you have laid yourself open to that accusation in the manner in which you've conducted this war? 85% of Gaza's population have been displaced. The World Food Programme has said that 80% of the most hungry people in the world right now are in Gaza. That directly arises from the way in which you have prosecuted not just the war, but the way in which you have dealt with the humanitarian situation in Gaza. This was not the only way you could have conducted this war. That is the point. There were other options to you. You have not availed yourself of those options.
Well, with your permission, I'll address what you raised in your question. It's true
Please.
that a large proportion, 85% of the population has been displaced. But why were they displaced? Because we asked them to leave areas of combat so they'd get out of harm's way. That has been documented.
And
Now,
20,000 Gazans have died. Over 20,000.
Well, those are Hamas's figures. They don't say how many of them are combatants, how many of them are civilians. They want you to believe, and South Africa in the court wants you to believe that they're all innocent civilians when that's clearly not true.
But there will be many innocent civilians, will there not?
Well, can you name, Lewis, and you're a student of history, can you tell me one war in modern history where civilians haven't been caught up in the crossfire?
No, but I can't.
Are you not holding,
not
holding Israel to a standard that no one else is held to?
No, I'm holding you to a standard that is that of a modern state, democratic state, and that is better than Hamas and better than others who would seek to attack Israel. And I can't think, I have to say, of a war in which 85% of a whole population have been displaced. I can't think of a war where over 100 journalists have been killed in only 3 months. I can't think of a war I can't think of a war, and that's from the American Committee to Protect Journalists figures, by the way. They're not my figures, and I can't think
Lewis,
of a war.
but let's be clear. If you talk about the journalists, let's first of all state the obvious fact that Israel is the only country in the region that protects and defends the freedom of the press. We're the only country that has a press that can criticize the government. Hamas, of course, allows no free press whatsoever. So to predict or to portray Israel as some enemy of the free press is frankly ridiculous, especially when you compare who we're fighting against.
Well,
but to be clear, on the first day of this war, on October 7th, when Hamas invaded our country with its army of terror and randomly killed people, they killed journalists.
Of course, they're appalling. But
did they kill them because they were journalists? They didn't kill them because they were journalists. They killed them because they were Israelis. They could have been bakers. They could have been farmers. They could have been doctors. Hamas killed everyone indiscriminately.
And that was completely appalling, and I would be the first one to
Correct.
say it. Nonetheless, we're talking about what has happened since, and of course,
But to say that
you would hold
Israel is
yourself to a
deliberately
high...
targeting Hamas propaganda, would you have you believe Israel deliberately targets journalists? That's just not true.
I didn't
That's
mention.
just not true.
I didn't suggest that you were deliberately targeting them, but what I am saying is that it is a mark of just how severe and how profound the situation in Gaza is that so many journalists have been killed in such a short period. More journalists have been killed in 3 months of Israel's war on Gaza than in all of World War II or the Vietnam War. In 2022, which is when the invasion happened, 15 journalists and media workers were killed in Ukraine. In the whole of 2022, over 100 have died in 3 months. That is, I mean, the journalists are just a small part of all of this, but that is a sign of just how profound and totalizing Israel's action against the civilian population of Gaza has been.
Israel's operation is against the Hamas military machine.
Yes,
it's not against the civilians.
But the result, whether you say that it is against them or otherwise, the result is the same. The result has been the same.
You're making a logical fallacy here. You're saying all the civilian deaths in Gaza are on Israel's hands. That's 100% not true.
Well, they wouldn't be dead if it wasn't for Israeli rockets.
No, they wouldn't be dead if Hamas hadn't had a deliberate policy, and not just Israel says so, the EU says so, the UK says so, the US says so, others say so, of deliberately using Gazan civilians as a human shield for its military machine. I mean, you've had on this program discussions about Hamas's use of hospitals for its military machine, its use of schools, its use of residential neighborhoods. You see Gaza above. Below Gaza, there is a subterranean network of military tunnels and launching sites for rockets and command and control. Hamas leaders today are under the city of Khan Yunis. We're trying to get them. But
So when
South
humans-
Africa,
so when-
in their indictment, ignores that. It's like Israel is there alone.
There is
Somehow there's not a war.
There is no doubt that Hamas are terrible people and that they have used their own civilians as human shields. There's no doubt about that. So, but you're saying, therefore, that when humans become human shields, that means they are just legitimate collateral damage in war,
No.
and you have no obligation
never
to them
said
at all.
that. I never
no,
said
but that's
that.
the
I
logical.
never said that.
That's your logical fallacy. That is what
No, it
your.
wasn't
That
my
is the
logic.
logical inference
No, I
of what
didn't
you're
ever-
saying.
No,
Well,
I
so
didn't
you have
say
no
that whatsoever.
But you're saying
I
that
never
if
said
they've
that.
died, you're saying that if those civilians have died, it's as a result of the fact that Hamas have used them as human shields, despite the fact that obviously they've died as a result of your attacks, your rockets, and so on. So what is your moral obligation to those people?
No, but when
Mr.
you
Regev?
say to me, when you throw to me the Hamas number that over 20,000 people have died, right?
Well, the
So
UN.
It's clear they're not all civilians.
Plenty
it's clear
of-
they're not all civilians.
Yeah.
It's clear they're not all civilians. It's clear also a large part of the civilians died from Hamas tactics and Hamas munitions. And therefore, once again, I'm willing to have a serious discussion about Israeli strategy. But this South African approach, which is basically they've decided to be the lawyer of the Hamas terrorist movement, that's what they're doing, which says Israel is guilty of genocide without understanding that we're in a war, without understanding the difficult combat conditions, without understanding Hamas's strategy of using Gaza civilians as a human shield. It's like out of fantasy land. It's like it's divorced from reality.
If let's imagine a situation in which the ICJ decides that you are guilty of perpetrating a genocide, would that make any difference to what Israel is doing?
My understanding of the court system is it'll be maybe up to 2 or 3 years before we finally get a result from the court. But I have to tell you, there are questions raised, like people came to us and said, why are you testifying in the court? And raised questions, and we've decided to go. But let's be clear, the court contains judges who don't come from countries with independent judiciaries, where you can expect the judge.
Then why are you a signatory to the convention if you do think the whole
We are,
thing's a
because
waste of time?
we are, and that's why we're there in the end. I'm just raising questions that become relevant when looking at the court. I'd ask you a question. There's a Lebanese judge on the panel. I mean, if he voted against the indictment, who knows what could happen to him in Lebanon? Yes, there's all sorts of considerations that need to be thought about.
So your signatory...
We have a strong case. We're making that case today. I hope you have a chance to watch You're broadcasting now, and it's going on as we speak. But
Indeed.
I think Israel's case is very, very strong, and people who are independent-minded, who are legal scholars, and just normal people with a sense of justice will hear the Israeli side of this case and understand that the South African allegation is baseless.
So, but to be clear, whenever it were to conclude, whether it's 2 years, 3 years' time, the Israeli government wouldn't accept what it said because you are suggesting that it is not a proper institution or that the process is flawed in some way.
I never said that.
So you would accept it? You would accept it?
I just look, the whole UN system, as you know, and as the British government has said, there's institutional bias in the UN against Israel.
Sounds, Mr. Regev, like
it
sounds like, Mr. Regev, you're just trying to discredit the institution in advance of anything it might say, which sounds like a sort of strategic decision for your government to do so.
Lewis, it's not Mark Regev and the Israeli government who've talked about UN bias against Israel. Kofi Annan, a former Secretary General, admitted as much. Ban Ki-moon publicly addressed the issue. The trouble today is the current Secretary General,
yes,
instead of combating institutional bias within his organization, seems to embrace it.
If you think that your case is so strong, why do you feel the need to try and discredit the institution? Why wouldn't you just say, well, the ICJ will doubtless come down on our side because our case is strong enough and it will clearly be compelling?
Because I'm aware of the institutional bias in the UN. I mean, you have all these votes in the United Nations where these automatic majorities against Israel. It happens almost routinely.
Well, perhaps that's because world opinion is not on your
Your own government has
side.
spoken out against... The UK government has spoken publicly about the issue of bias in UN institutions. It's not new. To deny that is to deny reality.
The Houthis' slogan is Allahu Akbar, death to America, death to Israel, cursed be the Jews, victory to Islam.
But you would accept that there is a link between what's happening in Israel, Gaza, and what has happened in the Red Sea, that there is a link.
Oh, absolutely, because Hamas and the Houthis are both proxies of the same Iranian regime that has been trying to destabilize the very welcome process of normalization that we've seen in recent years with the peace accords with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, with Saudi Arabia seemingly only around the corner. Iran is trying to scupper that by targeting Western targets in the region.
Well, of course, Eylon, some people would argue that Israel is doing a pretty good job by itself of scuppering that in the way that it's chosen to respond to the terrible atrocities which took place on October the 7th. And of course, in terms, if we're thinking about the Court of International Opinion, which to some extent we are seeing play out in The Hague yesterday, today, Israel making its defence today to what we saw on Thursday by the charges laid out by South Africa. I just want to read you something that one of the lawyers for South Africa said at the International Court of Justice. They said this: "It's becoming ever clearer that huge swathes of Gaza, entire towns, villages, refugee camps are being wiped from the map. Many of them have literally been blown to pieces. On current rates which show no sign of abating, each day, 3 medics, 2 teachers, more than 1 UN employee, more than 1 journalist will be killed, many while at work, and what appears to be targeted attacks on their family homes or when they're sheltering. The risk of famine will increase each day." Particularly on that first bit there, it's becoming ever clearer that huge swathes of Gaza are being wiped from the map. What part of that is wrong?
You know, it's very sad, the levels of loss of civilian life and destruction that we are seeing, and there is a reason for that. It's not because Israel woke up one bright morning and decided to bomb Gaza. It's because on October 7th, Hamas declared war against Israel. It launched an invasion of Israel by air, land and sea, and sent in death squads with a very clear mission to burn, behead, butcher, torture, mutilate as many people as they could, as brutally as they could.
So
now, in
Israel,
response,
Israel has there's no contingency about this. Israel has no power to decide what it is doing at the moment and the manner in which it's doing it. This was all just set in motion on October the 7th, and everything was inevitable from that moment.
Well, this is the context. Hamas declared war, and in response to that, we are fighting to do 2 things. First of all, to neutralize the threat from Hamas by dismantling its military and governing machines so it can never use the Gaza Strip to attack us again, as it says it wants to do again. After committing those brutal acts of genocide on October 7th, Hamas leaders said 1 October 7th was not enough. We want to teach Israel a lesson, and we'll do it again and again and again and again. And the second thing is, of course, to fight to bring back the hostages. 136 hostages who are still trapped in the
some of whom have been killed
dungeons
as a result of Israeli attacks.
Well, we know that 25 of them have been killed in captivity by Hamas, and we are fighting to bring them back.
Attacks.
There was the very tragic incident with the 3 hostages. But I just want to get back to the point about the destruction, if I may.
Yes.
Because I'm not sure people understand what Hamas did over the last 16 years in which it governed
but Eylon,
Gaza.
I don't want to get, with respect, I understand you can always choose a starting point of this, and some will say the last 16 years, some will say 1948, some will say even further back. I just want to focus on what's happened since October the 7th, which we can both agree, and I'm sure anyone listening to this will agree, were appalling, unspeakable crimes. But the point is how Israel has responded to that, which has been in your gift. And very often when you and other Israeli spokespeople that I interview and other people interview, you talk as if this is entirely inevitable, that a situation and a series of events was basically begun on that day, and Israel just had to respond in the way it did. No, you didn't. You could have chosen to respond in different ways. Of course you want to attack Hamas. Well, what you don't need to do is kill over 20,000 Palestinians, surely. People
Lewis,
in Gaza, many of whom will be innocent.
It's tragic and it's painful, and it's tragic to think that everyone who has been killed.
Eylon,
Lewis,
because
it is
surely
very
if it
painful.
were, your government wouldn't be doing it.
Lewis, I don't know whether any government in the world, having suffered the bloodiest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, the deadliest terror attack since 9/11, an armed invasion by air, land and sea, would say we're simply going to abandon hostages in the hands of that terror regime and leave it in power to attack us again, as it tells us it wants to do again and again. Our war has 2 very clear goals, and that's to destroy Hamas and bring back the hostages. Now, as for the level of destruction that we're seeing in Gaza, again, there's an address for that. Hamas, that spent the last 16 years deliberately embedding its military infrastructure underneath civilian areas. Of the 1,500 tunnel shafts that we found, for example, most of them have been in schools, hospitals, even UN facilities. Of course, the UN saying nothing about that. And of course, this war can end tomorrow. This war can end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders, lays down its arms, hands over the hostages. But if anyone thinks that we're going to abandon those vulnerable hostages,
no one would suggest that. No one would suggest that.
Well, some people,
but the way in which you've responded.
No, Lewis, but I want to stop, because these measures that South Africa is trying to take to the International Criminal Court of Justice are trying to make it impossible for Israel to exercise its legal obligations to defend its people in the wake of such atrocities.
No, but that is not true. What South
they
Africa,
are literally
what
asking
South
for an
Africa,
injunction
what
to
South
stop the
Africa,
hostilities.
The point of it is this, is that what South Africa is saying, and I don't want to get distracted before we even go down that road about South Africa as a player. I want to concentrate on what they're saying, the content of what they're saying, rather than the character.
The point of what they're saying is that, yes, October the 7th was appalling. We can all agree on that.
Well, South Africa didn't say that,
Okay.
actually.
No.
Because,
But the reason that
South Africa didn't say that.
But Eylon,
Lewis.
the reason they didn't say that is because in terms of genocide, it doesn't matter what happened on October the 7th. Genocide is absolute. So if it is the case that your state is committing genocide in Palestine, it doesn't matter what happened on October the 7th. It is no justification. So that is the point of what South Africa is saying. And that is why, actually, as appalling as it was, what happened on October the 7th is not germane to what is happening in terms of genocide, in terms of what is happening in Gaza now, and
Lewis,
what your
this
state is doing.
absolutely critical for understanding the context of the defensive
There's no
action
context
under
to genocide,
international
and
law.
I'm not saying that you are committing genocide, because it's not for me to say that. But if it were to be the case that your state is committing genocide, context
Which we are
is
not.
actually
Which
irrelevant.
we are not. No, because I have to push back on that. In response to the Hamas acts of genocide on October 7th, Israel has been launching a campaign to destroy the Hamas military machine. By the way, a campaign that right at the beginning, after October 7th, world leaders around the world said was entirely justified, because the only way to stop Hamas...
They're not saying that now,
repeating, I heard Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, just 2 weeks ago saying we must eradicate Hamas.
Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, said just the other day that he's concerned, or has been worried, that international humanitarian law may have been broken by your government.
Lord Cameron said a minute earlier that according to the information he has from Foreign Office lawyers, there have been no breaches of international law.
The point is not the fact that you responded, Eylon. No one who is right-thinking would at all criticise Israel for responding to the appalling abuses that took place on your citizens. The point is the manner in which you've responded and the proportionality. The former Pentagon intelligence analyst Mark Galasco has said to find a similar density of high explosives used in a small populated area, we might have to go back to the Vietnam War, when some 20,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Hanoi. Now, leaving aside whether we think this is actually going to realise your aims, which is deliver security to Israel, and if we're making the comparison with the Vietnam War, we can see it didn't do much for the United States, dropping over 20,000 tons of explosives on a tiny area. That is the point, that the proportionality is not proximate to what happened. And we can see that in terms of the casualties as well. Over 20,000 Palestinians dead in just 3 months.
Of whom how many are militants?
Well, we don't know that, but your
Well,
contention
we know.
surely you would accept that many civilians have died and been wounded and been maimed. And that is to leave aside the wider humanitarian situation.
Many civilians have been hurt. We know that 8,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed. When you look at that ratio of civilian to combatant ratio and you compare that to the UK's own wars in Afghanistan, Iraq and against ISIS, we find that in the context of counter-terrorism wars, that's very much in line and in fact exceeds the standards set by other armies. But I do want to explain this point, Lewis, before you move on to the next question. Israel spent weeks urging an evacuation of northern Gaza. And it spent weeks urging that evacuation because we do not want civilians to be hurt. We don't want them to be in harm's way. Hamas's whole strategy is based on using human shields and hiding behind civilians. Now, in order not to hurt civilians, we urged an evacuation. Notice that inherent contradiction in South Africa's argument, where it tries to claim that Israel's asking civilians to evacuate from a war zone is somehow evidence of genocide.
But they can't
intent.
evacuate from a war zone, can they, Eylon? Because they can't go anywhere.
Well,
that is what is unique about this conflict. Ultimately, they can't go anywhere. It is a tiny, tiny place. 85% of the population has been displaced. 85%. I can't think of a war where there would be anything remotely comparable to that.
Lewis, Hamas spent 16 years building its
Never mind
military
Hamas.
infrastructure.
I'm
No,
just
not never mind
concentrating-
Hamas.
No, it is
Lewis,
important,
not never
Eylon,
mind
because,
Hamas.
Because this is what you do. You always engage in whataboutery.
No,
now,
Lewis.
Hamas are terrible, terrible people. I will be the first to say that. I never, ever, and I don't think anyone right-thinking would defend them. But surely we must hold your government to a higher standard than these butchers.
Lewis, this isn't a question about whataboutism. This is a fact that Hamas built a military machine, and those targets are legitimate military targets. In order to reach those
20,000
military targets, in order to reach the military facilities that it built under homes, schools and hospitals, we need civilians to get out of harm's way. Here's what we've done. Can I tell you what we've done to get civilians out of harm's way? First of all, we spent 3 weeks urging an evacuation of northern Gaza before we moved in. As part of that, we placed 70,000 phone calls to Palestinians urging them to leave. We dropped 7 million leaflets, 14 million text messages, and 14 million voice messages as well. We secured a humanitarian corridor for people to be able to leave. We established a humanitarian zone and said, here is an area where Hamas is not operating. We think civilians should go there and the UN should set up tents. Now, the situation is so topsy-turvy that the UN then condemns us for designating a humanitarian zone. We are trying to keep civilians protected. And we are fighting against a cynical enemy that is trying to use them as human shields. And unfortunately,
and so your moral obligation, if you're right, Hamas terrible people, they use people as human shields. So your moral obligation to those people is discharged just because Hamas, who you accept are terrible, terrible people, are using people as human shields. So you're outsourcing your moral faculties to Hamas.
Not in the least. Our obligations are to continue to wage this war against Hamas, which it started in accordance with international law.
You mentioned the UN
and the principles. Well, Lewis, you asked me a question, and I'm trying to answer it.
Well, I know, but you've answered it fully. You mentioned the UN. As you know, the UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs has said Gaza has simply become uninhabitable. This is the other question, which is it's not just about the bombs that you're dropping and the attacks that you're making. It's in terms of whether Gazans can live. Is there enough food in Gaza right now?
Well, at the moment we have excess capacity at the Israeli crossings in order to allow more food into Gaza. We've been saying for weeks, anyone who wants to see more aid going into Gaza should simply send more food. We're now seeing, in fact, twice as many food trucks going into Gaza.
Why doesn't Israel send more then?
Why don't we send more?
Send food, yeah.
Into enemy-run territory as we are coming under rocket attacks and there are hostages in there who are being starved?
So you're happy, basically, that innocent Gazans starve just because maybe some of that food might end up in the mouths of Hamas
Lewis,
fighters.
Under international law, there is absolutely no obligation for a party that is at war with another party to supply it provisions.
I thought you weren't at war with the Palestinian people.
We are at war with Hamas, which governs the Gaza Strip. Our obligation under international law is to facilitate the delivery of aid necessary for the survival of the civilian population. That is what we are doing. And I don't recall any war in history in which one party to a war has sent civilians on the other side aid. By the way, that is what we are doing by streaming water into the Gaza Strip. Electricity that went into the Gaza Strip as well. Unfortunately, the same electricity that was used in order to perpetrate these attacks against us on October 7th.
But this is your problem at the ICJ, which is that you are leaving yourself open to the accusation, which many people would say has credibility, that you are starving an entire people, and a people that ultimately you are responsible for.
No, Lewis, these accusations are completely without any factual or legal basis.
80% of Gazans have no food.
Why don't they have food?
Well, for a start, you are not sending in, and you are not allowed, and you are
I'm sorry, Lewis.
You're consistently critiqued for not allowing enough humanitarian trucks to get into the Gaza Strip.
You're not sending food to Yemen. That doesn't mean you're not That doesn't mean you are starving Yemen. Israel has no obligation under international law
you have no obligation.
to send food. Send food? No. Our obligation under international law is to facilitate the delivery. That is why we have more than double the capacity to let more aid trucks in. And if you would like more food to go into Gaza, and we certainly hope more aid will reach civilians in Gaza, you should send it. What we think is outrageous is that the UN has not said a word about how Hamas has been hijacking that aid. We have videos of Hamas terrorists hijacking food trucks, and unfortunately UN officials have not a word of condemnation to say about that. And we hope people, by the way, Lewis, you speak about the UN with a great deal of moral admiration.
I didn't really. I'm citing what they've said.
As an authority, we hope people understand how poorly served they are by international officials who are trying to cover up the fact that they are covering up for Hamas.
Right. So you think the UN is in league with Hamas? That's your position.
We think that there is a very serious problem of complicity. Right. Okay. Well, I'll give you an example.
No, I just want to move on. We haven't got that much more time. You've made your point. One of the other claims. Well, you have. Well, the other claim.
I haven't, but we can move on.
All right. Okay. One of the other claims from South Africa is that genocide and hatred, and genocidal speech and hatred, has become embedded in the Israeli state, and that we've heard that from senior Israeli politicians, that hatred towards Palestinians has become normalized. Would you deny that?
I don't think that you should judge a country by angry remarks made by certain politicians in a time of war. I'm old enough to remember when President Obama spoke of ISIS as being a cancer. No one took that as being evidence of genocidal intent. On the contrary, the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister...
You wouldn't equate ISIS with the Palestinian people.
I would equate ISIS with Hamas, absolutely.
Okay, but, for example...
the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister and the War Cabinet have been very clear, both in word and in deed, that the Palestinian people are not our enemy. And we hope for the day that we can live in peace and prosperity with them as neighbours, the day after Hamas. But no matter how we want to achieve peace, that's not possible while they are governed by a terror organization whose sole rationale is the murder of Jews and the destruction of our country.
Yoav Gallant said, "We are fighting human animals. We'll eliminate everything.
Yes.
They will regret it."
Yes,
your Prime
correct.
Minister evoked a biblical analogy referring to the
let me
Israelites'
respond
enemy.
to the
You must
defense
remember what
minister's-
Amalek has done to you.
Let
Do
me
you
respond
remember?
to the defense
Major
minister's
General
remarks.
Ghassan Alan, there will be no electricity, no water in Gaza. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell. You will get hell. I mean, and you wonder why it is that a state like South Africa, which frankly has its own history of difficult human rights violations, is in a position to be able to turn around and say they want these people dead. Your own
Lewis,
government is saying it.
The defense minister called the Hamas death squads who invaded Israel, raped little girls, tortured and mutilated children, dismembered them human animals. And we think it's disgusting that South Africa and a whole panoply of human rights organizations are angrier that we called people who dismembered little children human animals than about the dismembering of those children themselves.
Moshe Feiglin, the founder of Israel's right-wing party,
He is an irrelevant
he's called
individual.
for the complete destruction of Gaza, but you can see that there is an atmosphere
I'm sorry,
which is developed.
I'm sorry, Lewis. He is not even a member of parliament. He is an irrelevant fringe figure who is not even an elected official. The elected officials and the government of Israel have been clear in word and in deed that the people of Gaza are not our enemy.
But it isn't just these people. I mean, you will know, for example, a group of prominent Israelis, and these include some of Israel's top scientists, the Royal Society member, Professor David Harel, academics, diplomats, former members of the Knesset. They themselves have said, not me saying this, that there is extensive and blatant incitement to genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza by influential public figures. They said that in a letter to your country's Attorney General and state prosecutors, and they demanded action to stop the normalization of language that breaks out both Israeli and international law. So it isn't just the outside world saying this, and it isn't just South Africa saying this, it's prominent Israelis saying this.
Lewis, we're talking about a war, and a war that is being waged.
So everything justifies it.
No, Lewis, I'm trying to finish my sentence. When you look at the statements of the elected officials who are running this war, I'm not talking about fringe individuals, and we have many fringe individuals who will say many strange things, just as Britain there are many fringe individuals who will say strange things. We have made clear the Palestinian people are not our enemy. Hamas is our enemy. The human animals and savages who brutally committed acts of gang rape, paedophilia and necrophilia on October 7th are our enemy. And we are fighting so that they can never hurt us again like they are promising to do, and to bring back the hostages who are being physically, psychologically and sexually tortured in the Hamas terror dungeons. And if anyone thinks that we are going to stop and simply abandon the hostages there, instead of waging this war in accordance with international law, they are sorely mistaken.
Why are so many journalists being killed in Gaza?
Well, one of the journalists who was killed recently happened to be hitching a ride with Hamas terrorists who was operating a drone. And if you have a look at that list of journalists who are killed, have you looked through the list?
I have looked at the list.
Have
yes.
you? How many did you
that's
count?
From the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Exactly. On that list, how many people did you find who are listed as being Hamas-affiliated media?
There were lots of people who work for Gazan media, yes, and some who work for Hamas-affiliated media.
At
but
least
you will accept
20.
that there have been journalists who've been killed who
I
do
don't
not.
think that you can be a card-carrying member of Hamas and a journalist as well. I think it would be equally preposterous to speak of ISIS-affiliated journalists being killed during the bombing campaign of Raqqa and Mosul, which, by the way, also left those cities uninhabitable.
Whether they're journalists or not, in some ways irrespective. I mean, more journalists have been killed in 3 months of Israel's war on Gaza than according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, more of all of World War II or the Vietnam War. Compare it to the Ukrainian war, which has obviously been going on for longer. 15 journalists were killed in the whole of 2022. Whether they're journalists or not, the fact that so many are dying does speak of the mass slaughter, doesn't it?
It speaks of the fact that Hamas is waging war from inside densely populated areas. Lewis, we didn't pick this battlefield. We didn't even pick this war.
No, but you're choosing the way
Lewis, we
that
don't
you prosecute
want
the war.
this
That's
war.
the point. I get that.
We don't
but you're
want
choosing
this
the way
war.
that you'll prosecute. It comes back to this
Do
constantly.
you have suggestions for... I'll pass them on. Do you have suggestions for how we should prosecute this instead?
If your military apparatus needs suggestions from elsewhere, I'm sure they can do so from
Our
other
military
Western
apparatus
states.
is convinced that we're doing a darn good job under international law, waging war. By the way, Lewis,
well, if someone once said in this country, they would say that, wouldn't they?
Uniquely challenging counter-terrorism battlefield. Lewis, no army in the history of the world has had to wage war against an enemy that has spent 16 years deliberately hiding under homes, schools, universities and hospitals. No army has ever done it. We are having to come up with innovative ways to try to minimize harm to civilians despite facing an enemy that is trying to maximize them, and a chorus of UN officials who are covering that up.
Just on the journalist point, what would you say? You will have seen the case, of course, of Mr. Wael Al Dardou, his son, a journalist, killed in an Israeli strike. Al Jazeera bureau chief there. His wife Anna, his grandchild, his 15-year-old son, 7-year-old daughter, all killed since October. I mean, again, that speaks to the absolute slaughter that's going on. That's one family.
Lewis.
You must hear that and be appalled, surely.
Lewis, war is awful.
And so there we go. That's it.
No, Lewis, war is awful, and we want this war to end. But we need this war to end in a way that makes sure that Hamas can't attack us again. Because if we do not destroy Hamas, the consequence of inaction is going to be that it will slaughter our people again like it did on October 7th. Now, we are facing a uniquely challenging battlefield that no army in the history of the world has dealt with. And we're doing a stellar job trying to adhere to the principles of proportionality,
Would there be
precaution, and
any
distinction.
civilian death toll that would be too high for you and for your government?
The civilian
to
death
justify?
toll is already high, and
Too
that is
high.
why we have been calling the hurt in this war is intolerable.
But you could, you could
And we
eliminate
want-
every Palestinian on the Gaza Strip. That would
No,
clearly
no,
be
Lewis, that would be
completely-
outrageous.
No, but of course it would be outrageous.
That
So
would be
what's the point?
outrageous.
What's the level?
I think it's appalling of you to even suggest that.
Well, I'm trying to explore the logic of what your government is saying. I'm trying to explore
Our logic-
explore what point
Our logic-
is the collateral damage, to use that terrible phrase, is it too great? Or is there no point to
Our
achieve your
logic-
military objectives?
Is that we are going after Hamas military infrastructure in accordance with the principles of international law.
Until you decide enough is enough.
Well, we set a test for when this war can end. We called it the diplomat babysitter test. This war will end when the diplomats at the United Nations who voted to save the skin of the Hamas terror regime would feel safe taking responsibility to babysit children in Kfar Aza, in Be'eri, and near Oz. Because our children have a right to sleep in their beds without being slaughtered. We don't think that's too much to ask for. We think it's basic humanity and basic human rights. And in order for that to happen, the Hamas terror regime cannot be their neighbor. You know, Lewis, we're in this situation now because for many years, Israel tried to do everything not to have this conflict. When there were calls in Israel that said, topple Hamas, destroy it now, we didn't do it because we knew that the cost of war would be unbearably high. But we're in this war now.
Israel didn't do absolutely everything it could have done, did it? In the sense that what Israel could have done is to try and generate and sustain a permanent political solution. And your Prime Minister is on the record as saying,
Lewis,
I am
Hamas
proud.
doesn't
Let me
want-
finish. I am proud that I prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state. That is what your Prime Minister said.
Lewis.
So the idea that Israel has done everything it could to ensure there is a settlement in the Middle East is preposterous.
Hamas does not want a political solution. Hamas wants the final solution. Hamas is an internationally prescribed terrorist organization that openly states its genocidal intentions against Jews and against the people of Israel. And we are dealing with a territory that is governed by a terrorist organization that the UK certainly prescribes as a terrorist organization. It isn't possible, Lewis, to reach political settlement with an army of terror that thinks brutally gang raping a woman and then chopping off her breast and playing with it like a football at the Nova Festival. That is not an organization with which you can reach a political settlement. We very much hope, Lewis, that one day we will be able to reach a permanent negotiated settlement with our Palestinian neighbors. In order for that to happen, we're going to have to see the Palestinians accept that the state of Israel is here to exist and is here to stay.
And so you would like to see a Palestinian state? Your government, your Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has said we think the Palestinians should have all the rights to govern themselves and none of the powers to threaten us. Now, I'll tell you what
So it's funny,
conversations...
Israel's always in the position where it gets to set all of the terms in all of this, isn't it? You decide when the war ends, you decide what sort of state they have, you decide when the settlement can happen and when it can't. I mean, do these people not have rights to self-determination in their own terms, Eylon?
Lewis, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. We gave the Palestinians the keys to Gaza and said, we want to see you build an economically and politically prosperous area here. And what we got in response was not only 20 years of rocket fire, but death squads that perpetrated the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. One question that many Israelis will be asking, because this isn't a hypothetical seminar, this is literally life and death for us, is that the West Bank is a mountain range that overlooks Tel Aviv and surrounds Jerusalem. Not only would rocket fire from there give you 20 seconds to run for shelter, not 90 seconds, as in the Gaza Strip. The risk now is of the sort of appalling slaughter that we saw on October 7th on a much larger scale. We want there to be peace with the Palestinians. For that to happen, they can't keep hearing people on the streets of London chanting from the river to the sea, because that tells them you don't need to compromise. You don't need to accept that the state of Israel has a right to exist and it's here to stay, because you can continue indulging these dreams of violent struggle.
Right, so Palestinian statehood is not only dependent on what Gazans or Palestinians do in Gaza and the West Bank, it's even dependent on what happens in London and happens in capitals of the West. That's how contingent Palestinian statehood might be.
Well, the question of how we achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians is based on the other side's commitment to genuinely achieving a secure peace.
I'm conscious
the
we've
problem,
got to let you go.
Lewis,
So just one more question about
Sure.
the ICJ, if you don't mind. If the ICJ were to rule against you, in the preliminary round, the actual eventual conclusions may take many years, but in terms of their preliminary assessment, will you comply with their stipulations?
we fully expect the ICJ to throw out this spurious claim.
No, but if they don't, will
I'm
you
not going
comply?
to answer absurd hypotheticals.
It's
because
not absurd hypothetical.
No,
It's either
Lewis,
yes or no.
It is
could
an
easily
absurd
happen.
hypothetical, because when you have parents sitting in that courtroom whose children were abducted and being held as hostages, the idea that an international court of justice that is supposed to uphold international law might actually order those parents to stop fighting to bring back their
So
children
you'll adhere to a court judgment if they rule your way.
It's an
What
absurd
kind of kangaroo
hypothetical.
court would that be?
It's an absurd hypothetical.
Why
It's not-
are you even signatories to the convention if you are unwilling to commit to abide by the means by which that convention is policed and enforced? What is the point?
Lewis, the State of Israel was one of the first signatories to the Genocide Convention, because the crime of genocide
And
was
so I would have
defined-
thought that the State of Israel would be the first to say that they would want to see that court stipulations are adhered to for
the
precisely
State
the
of
reason
Israel
you are
would
referring
like to see international law being applied fairly, understanding that to
in
the
the way that
extent...
Israel wants.
No, in a way that understands that on October 7th, we were the victims of an act of genocide, and we are now exercising our inherent right
And
under
Hamas is not a
international
signatory
law.
to the convention. That is why they are not in court, because they are not a state, as you often
No,
fond of
instead
saying,
it has
and
South
because they are
Africa
not a-
acting as its legal arm. Tragically, we think it is
What
very
on earth
sad.
does that mean? Just
Well,
engage.
South Africa.
Have you ever heard of the phrase of playing the actual issue rather than the man?
South Africa is playing advocate for the devil. South Africa, which has aligned itself with Russia and China and Iran, the same South Africa that invited Iran, which backs the Houthi rebels, to be part of the BRICS, has decided to throw its lot in with Iran.
What do you think it
and,
says
and
for
Hamas.
What do you think
and
it
on
says,
October 8th,
what do you think it
Lewis,
says
you
from
asked me a
Israel?
question.
What do you think it says from Israel's moral authority that you're basically saying that you will only obey what a court says if they agree with you? That's not how courts work. The whole of society, as you know, would dissolve into disorder and anarchy. You're basically saying international law does not matter to you.
I'm not saying that. You're putting words in my mouth.
Well, it's
what
the
I am
logical
saying,
inference of
what
what
I'm
you're saying.
saying is that as 136 hostages are still trapped and being starved and raped in the Hamas terror dungeons, the thought that the International Court of Justice might order Israel to cease its efforts to bring them back home to safety is something so horrific that I can't even imagine.
But they
that
might say,
scenario.
for example, that they want you to ensure that there is access to see what's going on at the moment, that there are documents available to them, all of these stipulations that might enforce and help them understand what is happening. Would you not? Your government will at least accept that, surely.
Well, the State of Israel at the moment is being part of these proceedings and has presented very clearly evidence of the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated and the extensive efforts that we have made in this uniquely challenging environment to try to keep civilians safe, despite Hamas's efforts to keep them in harm's way. All that evidence was laid out in our legal team's stonking performance at the ICJ, including as part of our legal team, Professor Malcolm Shaw, who literally wrote the textbook on international law and literally wrote the International Committee of the Red Cross's suggested reading on genocide and international law.
And you're confident that Israel has obeyed international law, international humanitarian law at all times?
Yes.
Mr. Levy, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Lewis.